Achtung! Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk, Alamein week. And we've done the first battle, which means...
We've done the background, we've done the flight, we've done the first battle.
But so not far round the corner is the second battle. But James, we've been framing these with some verse, because you want to hear from the people going through this, I think.
Well, I've chosen another one from Keith Douglas, just because, he was there.
Yeah.
And he's writing about exactly what we're talking about. So the first one was Vergiss my Nick, about the dead German and the letter he sees and the photograph. This one is about his own comrades in arms, and it's called Aristocrats. The noble horse with courage in his eye, clean in the bone, looks up at a shell burst. Away fly the images of the shires, but he puts the pipe back in his mouth. Peter was unfortunately killed by an 88. It took his leg away. He died in the ambulance. I saw him crawling on the sand. He said, "It's most unfair. They've shot my foot off. How can I live among this gentle, obsolescent breed of heroes and not weep? Unicorns, almost, for they are fading into two legends, in which their stupidity and chivalry are celebrated. Each, fool and hero, will be an immortal. These plains were their cricket pitch, and in the mountains the tremendous drop fences brought down some of the runners. Here then, under the stones and earth, they dispose themselves, I think with their famous unconcern. It is not gunfire, I hear, but a hunting horn." And I love that and I think it's appropriate for now, because it marks the start of the transition, I think. He, of course, is writing about the Sherwood Rangers, and they, at this precise moment, were going from amateurs, those unicorns almost, the people who have sort of, framing everything in terms of cricket pitches and horse racing, to suddenly actually getting a grip and becoming really rather good at what they did.
So at the end of the last episode, Alex and Monty take over. And what's very interesting is there's a considerable amount of debate around what, in the end, are they simply inheriting a load of stuff? They're picking up reins that someone has already been using. But it's quite clear that the arrival of these two is electrifying on 8th Army. 13th of August, Monty gets his guys together, and he's
not supposed to take over till the 15th.
Yes, exactly.
He hustles up there immediately anyway.
He don't care. I mean, this is the Monty way. There's a war on, and he knows best. So he says the defence of Egypt lies here at Alamein, and on the Ruwais Ridge. What is the use of digging trenches in the delta? It is quite useless. If we lose this position, we lose Egypt. All the fighting troops now in the delta must come out here and fight at once, and will. Here we will stand and fight. There will be no further withdrawal. I have ordered that all plans and instructions dealing with further withdrawal are to be burnt, and at once. We will stand and fight here. If we can't stay alive, then let us stay here dead. Now, the thing is, what else is 8th Army going to do? But what's really interesting, and Jonathan Fennell's fantastic on this in his Fighting the People's War thing, in the census reports, this message from the top of 8th Army goes right through everyone's mailbag. They're all talking about it. Because what Freiberg then goes and talks to his, on the 16th of August, goes and talks to his chaps. I want to make the army commander's views clear to everybody. This looking over your shoulder and cranking up to get back to the position in the rear is to cease. Here we're going to stay and here we're going to fight. There's no question of going to any back position from here. We are to make this position as complete as we can. And then Kippenberg says the same stuff. And it goes straight into the men's letters. And what's striking about that is that this is, Jonathan's really brilliant on this. In July, in the Kiwi mailbag, 1% of the blokes writing home have anything good to say about Tommy. They think they're fighting a losing battle. They're looking over their shoulders. The whole thing's a shit show. But Monty, and of course, I know that that it's more complicated, perhaps, than one chap coming in and stuffing people up. But this message, this central idea, then runs right through 8th Army.
Yeah. I totally agree. I think,
and it's very striking.
But I do think we need to take a step further back from that, because because Alexander gets out there first, and you saying that the arrival of this pair is electrifying, and I think it's really important to stress that this is, in the narrative, it's always Monty's show, but I think, and part of that is because Alexander, it's not in his nature to blow his own trumpet. He's not a media hawk by any stretch of the imagination, and he's coming at it from a completely different perspective. What you get with Alexander is you get a general who looks like a general. He carries himself. He's immaculate. He's good looking. He's got a record which is absolutely second to none, and people know it.
Yeah.
This is a guy who's a winner. So just him arriving is just really good news. He is this guy who's commanded troops in battle at every rank.
Yeah.
Including German troops in the Baltic Landwehr in 1919, 1920, in the Russian Civil War.
He's just had a rough time in Burma, though, hasn't he?
Yes, he has, but he's been shoehorned in to bring in and stop the rot and get the Burma Corps across the Irrawaddy, and he does it. So he fulfills the brief that he's got. He's the last British soldier to leave Dunkirk, and his caps are made by his own hat maker in St James's with a sort of slightly higher peak, which he adopted from the Russians back in 1919. He rather liked the look of it.
Lock and Co, I believe. If you ever are on St James, go in there and get your head measured with the head measuring machine that they've got. That because they've a selection of head measurements, including Monty's, where they've got the little thing that is your hat fitting. Charlie Chaplin, Monty, Her Majesty the Queen.
There you are, same people. And so he comes already with there is nothing on him that suggests association with failure, with a lack of experience, a lack of knowledge. He's just got it, and he's got charm and abundance. And what he does is he wins people over. He's got a kind of aura about him, which no one else who has been in command in the Middle East or the desert, they just don't have it in the same way. He's just got this imperturbability, this calm assurance, and unlike Wavell, unlike Auchinleck, he's already seen in the Second World. I know Auchinleck was briefly in Norway, but he's overseen significant battles in command where he's absolutely cut the mustard.
Yeah.
So already that's a fill-in, because here's someone who means business. He's one of the kind of top draw guys who's come in. He's been and he goes around Cairo and he goes around all the base stations and he goes up to 8th Army, and what he sees is massively plummeting morale, and he understands absolutely that is a problem. And it is actually he who says to Monty, there can be no withdrawals, which is why we've got the independent company T-shirt with that on.
Yeah.
Obviously, it goes without saying that Monty is in complete agreement with him, and that there is not even a discussion over this. I mean, they are absolutely of the same mind. But it is Alexander, when he arrives, who says, there can be no more withdrawals. That is his line, and it is adopted. So it goes from command to army to corps to division to brigade, all the way down.
And Monty's his hand on earth, really, isn't he, in this sort of relationship, isn't he?
Exactly. And the other thing that Alexander says is he says Cairo has got too many distractions. It's too much of a flesh pot. It's too busy. There's too many distractions at the Gezira Sporting Club, at Shepherd's Veranda, all this kind of stuff. This is not the place. I'm going to move my headquarters out of town. I'm going to move it to Gezira, where the Giza, rather, where the pyramids are. And he sets up his own camp, which he calls Caledon Camp, which is after his ancestral land back at home in Ireland, which is Caledon, and his older brother is the Earl of Caledon. And Caledon Camp is set up, and he streamlines the whole thing. He says, I don't want all this fluff. I don't want all this. This is going to be a much more streamlined staff, and we're going to work hard in the desert, where we're going to concentrate on the job in hand and not kind of knock off at 3 and go off to Shepherd's Hotel and all this kind of stuff. Go and play polo.
Well, yes, because that's the Monty thing about, everyone buggers off to the Shepherd's Hotel in Cairo and has a good time.
And so this message is already come down to, so he and Monty absolutely is one. And so he is the guy. So he says to Monty, right, I am going to protect you. He doesn't say this to Monty, but what he decides is, I'm going to protect Monty. I'm going to give Monty what he wants. I'm going to be the facilitator. And this is the other thing I think is really important to understand about Alexander, is that very, very few officers instinctively understand this, that as you go up the ranks, your role changes. And what he understands is that when he's a commander-in-chief of a command, rather than an army commander, his role is a facilitator. It's an overseer. It's the chairman of the board to Monty's CEO. And it's important that he is the buffer between Montgomery and Whitehall, Churchill and Brooke.
Yeah.
That any problems at that higher level go to him. He doesn't bother Monty with them. Monty's job is just to sort out Eighth Army and nothing else. And so he puts everything that he needs to do and put in practice. And there is a lot of stress from Churchill right from the word go. You need to get on, but you need to counterattack.
Yeah.
And Alex just dead bats it back. And so what it means is that Monty can go into the desert, have a look at Eighth Army, and together with Alexander, they agree what needs to happen. They need to be resupplied. They need to be retrained. They need to work out the armor, particularly. It's how you use the armor in this environment that is the big conundrum. And the first thing Monty does when he sees Mary Conyngham goes, we've been really trying. We think it'd be a really good idea if the Desert Air Force and Eighth Army Tactical Headquarters shared a headquarters.
Put the two tents together. No.
and Monty goes, brilliant. And Tommy Elmhurst loves him, says he's a veritable little tiger. And he stands up and does this speech to all the army commanders. So he gathers around the corps commanders and divisional commanders, plus the Desert Air Force guys. And he stands up and he goes, gather around. He says, there is no discipline in this army. None. And from today, anyone in Eighth Army who bellyaches about orders received from his superior, whether colonels or brigadiers to divisional commanders to corps commanders, or corps commanders to me, will go very quickly to the worst place I can think of. The very worst. The veranda of the Shepherd's Hotel in Cairo. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
And Mary and Tommy just go, woo, bring it on.
I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? Because Gott, who obviously isn't in this story.
No.
By the point he gets the job that Monty's inherited, a lot of people think he's done. He's also,
it's a terrible appointment. He doesn't want to do it.
Yeah, and he's totally tangled up in what's gone before, and the business of a new broom, and like you say, this combination. So you've got the sort of the smooth. I mean, if you you could look at it. You've got the smooth establishment guy, which is Alex, because he very much is. He's a guardsman. He's very much
establishment,
and the sort of person Churchill likes. And then Monty, who also kind of fits the Churchill Maverick bracket.
It's a perfect team.
I mean, I don't want to sound like an idiot, but the creative tension of that pairing is really important. But Monty comes in, and one of the things I think what's really interesting about his assessment of Eighth Army, and this is reflected, and obviously we've got to talk about Alam Halfa, but it's reflected in the Second Battle of Alamein, is he looks at Eighth Army and he goes, right, there's things you can do that you're capable of, and there's things you are not capable of. And part of this 3Ms thing is when you're given stuff to do you can't do because you're not well trained enough, or because your commanders aren't up to it,
and you haven't got enough of it.
You haven't got enough of the kit. Your morale goes down the toilet, and so you perform badly. And so whatever my strategy is, because I can't pull it off tactically, I have no strategy, and strategy could go hang. And so very much what Monty does is a big part of his shakedown is to be realistic about Eighth Army.
Yes.
Not to go, I can turn this thing into an absolute fighting blade of a machine in the time I've got. He thinks, right, this works, that doesn't work. Artillery's been proven, as we said in the last episode, to be particularly effective, certainly on the first day of the First Battle of Alamein.
So is the Air Force. So let's harness that.
So is the Air Force. So he's looking at it from the point of view of, right, and the thing that doesn't work and that I've really got to try and get a handle on is this cavalry charge stuff.
Yes, but again, this is where he's got a meeting of minds with Alex, because Alex is also of exactly the same opinion that the conscript army, you need to keep it simple.
Yeah.
You need to supply them well, train them in the basics,
Yeah.
So they're like automatons. You need, it's Alex's idea to set up the battle schools,
Yeah.
which is this idea that you have simple instructions, you use live ammunition, you give them a taste of what it's going to be like, so that when they go into action, they know what they're going to do.
Yeah.
And so this is, and he is absolutely as one with Monty on the problems of how to use the armor and better coordination between the infantry and the artillery.
Yeah.
So it is absolutely a marriage of minds.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting, guess who he chooses to be his chief of staff?
Yeah. Well, it's
Dick McCreary,
who's been fired.
Who's been fired by the Auckland and is waiting for a passage home. And he
Yeah.
goes, "You know a lot about armor, don't you?" And McCreary goes, "Yes." And he goes, "I want you as my chief of staff," because he recognises that understanding how you harness armor with infantry and artillery is key to the whole thing. So Monty immediately says to Alex, I see the way I see this is creating a corps de chasse. So this is the exploitation force, which on one level looks exactly like the Auchinleck thing, which is punch a hole with the infantry and then the cavalry burst through. But it's not the same, because the corps de chasse is an all-arms unit. It's like a panzer division. It's an all-arms motorised combination which can exploit, and they're operating together. So my old friend Albert Martin, for example, who was in the 7th Motor Brigade, 7th Motor Brigade get taken out of 7th Armoured Brigade, Armoured Division, and moved into the 1st Armoured Division, which is the beating heart of the 10 Corps that he creates, this corps de chasse.
Yeah.
Get very annoyed. They have to paint over the Jerboas and put on a pointless, useless, idiotic rhino instead. He gets very cross about it. But the point is, they're not just, and they're being retrained as anti-tank gunners.
Yeah.
On 6-pounders.
Yeah.
So the point is, you're using motorized infantry, tanks, with anti-tank guns and artillery together in a cohesive unit, and that's the big difference.
And the other thing is, obviously, you get Monty stuff in, which is to train, which is what he's been doing in England. I met an Alamein veteran a very long time ago who said, I hated him. He cancelled the beer ration. Right. So, so Monty's footprint in looking after his men goes right down into literally into their daily habits. This guy knew it was him that had done that as well. So,
yeah.
So this is the thing. And this, Montgomery makes his presence known. He makes sure he visits people. He's trying to inspire confidence in his generalship. He experiments with hats. There's that fantastic Australian bush hat picture where he's got tons of badges on.
Jack Fraser is the guy, isn't he? He's in 6 RTR. He's with Mike. Do you remember what I mentioned the other day? Sam Bradshaw from Liverpool. Yeah. He's in 6 RTR. So he goes and visits 6 RTR, and they're really impressed with him. They like what he says. And he's wearing an Aussie bush hat at the time. And Jack Fraser says to him, "Why don't you try this beret, sir?" Yeah. And they put him in a Grant tank. And Monty goes, "Do you know what? That's my look."
It's extraordinary, isn't it?
And it's genius. It's genius in its simplicity. But once he gets there, they know from intelligence that Rommel is building up to plan an attack. So Montgomery says, right from the word go, okay, what we're doing, we're going to hold that attack, build up our strength, and then we will counterattack. We will only counterattack when we're ready. But first of all, we've got to be ready for this attack when it comes. And what I don't want is anyone charging off after them. It's a purely defensive battle just to stop them. No balaclava charges. 23rd Armoured Brigade, you're on notice. No charging. Just stay where you are and just see it off. And I'm going to rely on the RAF to do as much of the hard yards as possible, and this is what's going to happen.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because none of these charges have particularly worked well. Yet people are wedded to it as the kind of their option, their only option.
It is incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, it is extraordinary that I mean, it's definition of madness stuff, isn't it? Trying the same thing over and over again. It falls into that, expecting a different result. It falls into that sort of category.
Yes, it's like the Japanese continuing to advance down the same wadi every night.
Yeah.
But we should talk briefly. But we should take a break in a minute. But we should talk about just very quickly about Rommel's situation.
Well, no, we need to go to the other side of the hill. Yeah, exactly. So
go to the other side of the hill. So should we do that before the break? I think we've got time.
Yeah, why not? So Rommel's done what he ought to do, which is stop.
Yes.
Lick his wounds, have a think, weigh stuff up. He's lost Seabohm and Fellers as his sources of intelligence, so he knows a lot less about what's going on in 8th Army.
He's knackered. He's absolutely exhausted.
He's exhausted. His men are exhausted.
And his situation is a problem because suddenly Alexandria is 60 miles away. Cairo is sort of 85, something like that.
Yeah.
They're only 150 miles from Suez Canal, etc., etc. So 8th Army's supply line situation is suddenly looking fantastically good. And they're getting more supplies anyway. Rommel reckons he needs 100,000 tons of supplies a month. The problem is that Tripoli is by far and away the biggest port, and that's 1,300 miles away.
Yes.
Then the next biggest is Benghazi, which is 800 miles away. Tobruk is small, and that's 300 miles away. And Mersa Matruh is tiny, and that's 100 miles away. So the closer the ports get, the smaller they become. And what's really interesting is that between May and August, all shipping pretty much, 95% of this shipping gets through to Benghazi. And Benghazi is the main port.
Yeah.
And actually, because their big ships have all gone, smaller ports are sort of okay. It's the handling issue that's the real problem of sort of getting it on and off.
Yeah.
So the Axis are forced to use ever smaller boats across the Mediterranean because their large ones have gone in 1941 and 40 and all the rest. But in May and August, they're largely untouched because Malta is subdued.
Well, I was just going to say, there's a meanwhile here, isn't there, Jim? Meanwhile, in Malta,
and of course, Pedestal Convoy is successful. The Ohio coming in on the feast day of Santa Maria on the 15th of August, and that transforms everything because suddenly, within a matter of days, RAF can operate from Malta, but also use it as a staging post.
Yeah.
So you can set off from Egypt, and you can fly over up the coast to Benghazi, and then turn off up to Malta and stage in Malta, and ditto from Tripoli. So that changes a lot, and the problem is that although 91,000 tons of supplies are delivered to the Axis forces in North Africa in July, half of the fuel ration that they get is used up in delivering it to the front. They're just getting it there, which is obviously crazy.
You need twice the fuel ration to deliver the fuel ration. Is the problem with the fuel ration?
And although the smaller ships means you can use smaller ports, obviously it's economies of scale.
Yeah.
And it takes longer to unload and load because there's different ships. It's much easier to do it on one ship rather than 12. And he says, unless I get 2,000 cubic meters of fuel, 500 tons of ammunition by the 25th of August, and a further 2,000 cubic meters of fuel by the 27th, and 2,000 tons of ammunition by the 30th, I cannot proceed. And in contrast at this moment, the British are now unloading 100,000 tons of fuel a month.
Right, a month.
Just fuel. So not ammunition, not tanks, just fuel.
Right.
But Rommel does launch his attack anyway, even though
of course he does.
His ships are on the way, because that's the Rommel way.
I mean, he's obviously got Hitler on the phone going, you're only 150 miles from the Suez Canal. You're only 60 miles from Cairo. What's the problem? He's under that pressure too, isn't he?
Well, he's got this convoy of, I think it's 9 ships which are due to come in by the end of the month. And by the time he launches, 3 of those precious fuel tankers have already been sunk.
Yeah.
And he thinks, okay, well, the next one's due in. The San Andreas is due in on the 30th. So maybe I'll just, hopefully that'll get in. But that's sunk too. By that time, it's too late.
That's Ultra, isn't it? It's Ultra and subs. Is it submarines operating out of Malta?
It's submarines and ships. Yeah. So the 10th submarine flotilla is now back in Malta.
Yeah.
And it's just, the combination is just devastating. And the combination of Ultra, these decrypts of Enigma traffic, so that means they know exactly when the convoys are coming. They send over reconnaissance planes from Malta. They're spotted. 2 minutes later, bow fighters turn up and Wellingtons and submarines, and it's game over.
Well, should we take a break?
Yeah, or what, on the hinge of what's happening with Alamein Alpha?
And then talk about the Battle of Alamein Alpha, and then finally, however many episodes we are into this, set the stage for the second Battle of Alamein. We'll be back in a second. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Alamein Week.
Alamein Week.
Alamein Week. Alamein Week. With
Alamein Week.
Me, Al Murray, and James Holland, of course. And we've just got to the Battle of Alamein Alpha, which is, it's not a stalemate, this one, is it, Jim?
No, this is definitely not a stalemate. It's not a stalemate. No, because I think you have to judge a battle also by what you're trying to achieve in the battle. I mean, if your aim is just to defend the enemy, which is what Auchinleck's aim is at the beginning of July when Rommel first attacks, then I think you can say that's a victory for him. But if your aim is to break through the Axis positions in a counterattack attempt 1, 2, 3, 4, and you don't, then you can't call that a victory.
No.
I think you can call this a victory for Montgomery because his aim is purely to stop it.
Yes.
And
because he's concluded that doing these harebrained counterattacks is something Eighth Army isn't capable of. So don't offer yourself up for defeat, because otherwise you cause a morale collapse, and then you can't do anything. Then you can't bring anything into effect. And it's a straight line, that piece of thinking, isn't it? It's not difficult. And I think the people he's dealing with, the generals, the commanders, army commanders he's dealing with, generals he's dealing with, they know he's right about this, that they've been biting off more than they can chew, don't they?
Yes.
And so it's not a controversial policy that he's brought with him, that him and Alex are enforcing, is it at all?
No.
Because what's interesting is morale goes up because the men feel like they're being taken care of and they're being listened to and they're being trained properly.
Yeah.
And it starts to creep up again, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So Alamein.
So it's interesting because Alamein is a big ridge, and that is, if you're thinking about your arm again, it doesn't quite work, the clock analogy, but it's sort of pointing at kind of 2 o'clock, I would say. But it's further east. So it's the most western part of the Alamein ridge is south of the most eastern part of the Ruwaiset ridge.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Yes.
So it's sort of very firmly in the British bit. But even by this stage, the most heavily defended part of the line is the northern half, and then slightly to the west you've got the Alamein ridge, and below that is very much the sort of the second half of the line. Below Alamein and Alamein, all the way down to the Katara Depression and the Himaymat feature, this weird kind of sort of Monument Valley kind of looking thing, is the second half of the line. And underneath south of the Alamein ridge it's interesting because that's the bit where, do you remember when we were talking about the Alamein line in an early episode, we were saying there's all these weird little cliffs and some 3 foot high, some 20 foot high, these little escarpments and stuff. And it's much more gravelly there. It's a completely different part of the line to the very northern bit. But his plan is basically exactly the same as the Ghazala line.
Yeah. Which
is to cut through to the south, cut through, and then cut up behind and encircle them in a drive to the coast. And that's exactly his plan for the Ghazala line, and exactly now for Alamein. And it's interesting because suddenly that feels a bit stale. And it feels like Rommel's run out of ideas.
Well, and Eighth Army's changed as well. It's being handled differently. So his circumstances have altered. He's running on a set of assumptions, isn't he? But it'll be the same old thing. British are going to defend this in the same way and get this wrong in the same way. And there's been a deliberate change in defensive policy. I mean, he still does get round the bottom of the line, doesn't he?
Well, sort of. So it's interesting because he attacks on the night of the 30th.
Yeah.
And they get hammered while they're coming through by the RAF. Wellington's come over and they're struggling through minefields. And because Monty knows what his plan is, he can prepare for it. So 7th Motor Brigade, my old friend Albert Martin, he's down there now having retrained with 6-pounders.
Yeah.
And so they've got a screen of motorised 6-pounders attached to, which they've quickly unshackled. And they're waiting for the tanks to come onto them. And as the tanks approach, they just open fire and they start hammering at these things. And then once they start getting, too close, they hitch up their 6-pounders and move out of the way.
Yeah.
At which point, yet more RAF come over and pound them as they're kind of struggling to make much advance. 30 Panzers are hit and going up in smoke in quick order in that morning of the 31st of August. General Nehring, who is the commander of the Afrika Corps, he's wounded. And by 9 a.m., they're 3 hours behind schedule.
Yeah.
And as we all know with these things, getting behind schedule is not great.
And also, it's daylight now.
It's daylight now.
So you can be seen miles off. Also, you also have 6-pounders now, which you didn't have before. Yep. So the scales have been evened in terms of what you can do anti-tank wise. And as you said, people have been trained for exactly this role.
And you're coming along the valley, effectively, although it's dead flat, below Alamein and Alamein.
Yeah.
So the British, the 8th Army, is on those ridges, and you, the Afrika Corps, are not.
Yeah.
So then desert winds whip up again, causing a massive sandstorm. So that prevents the RAF from coming in and hammering them again, and does allow them to kind of make a little bit more progress. But when they get going again, this time they run into artillery and also the armour of the 22nd Armoured Brigade, who are not playing ball. And so they can't get up, they can't swing north. over the Alam Halfa Ridge. They cannot do that cutback. So all they're doing is going in a straight line from kind of west to east, rather than in a big curve round the back. They just can't do that. And as darkness falls on that first day, on the 31st of August, the RAF return again and absolutely hammer the panzers. And not only do they hammer the panzers, they hammer the resupply. So the following morning, on the 1st of September, 21st Panzer cannot move. They've run out of fuel. They can't go anywhere. They're absolutely sitting ducks. And 15 Panzer do manage to get going and come into contact with 8th Armour Brigade. And 8th Armour Brigade is their first outing as tanks. This is the Sherwood Rangers. And what do the Sherwood Rangers do as 15th Panzer pulls back?
They do a balaclava charge, Jim.
They do a balaclava charge. They do a balaclava charge. Yes. And they get shot up, and 8 of them get knocked out just like that. And our friend John Semkin, remember him?
Yeah.
He's at headquarters, and he's in a I think a Grant tank, and he's watching it. And he's just going, "No, what are you doing? Come back." And of course, that's why I read that poem at the beginning of this.
Yes.
For that reason, because that's exactly what they did. So they don't have the best evidence. But apart from them, these newbies, most of them do not try and counterattack. And throughout the 1st of September, the RAF just pounds them relentlessly. And they're caught in this huge, wide expanse on this very tricky ground where there are no clear lines of repose. But because of those ridges, because of those little escarpments all over the place, you can't just swivel around and just beetle off. You've got to kind of twist and turn and watch where you're going. It's not plain sailing. And they just pace them all the way, all the way back. And so by the morning of the 2nd of September, Rommel has to go on the defensive, having left countless panzers burning and smouldering on the open expanse below Alam Halfa and Alam Nail. And it's all over. It is all over. And that is the point where he is no longer going to win. There aren't going to be any more reversals, because Alex and Monty are going to make sure that however tough the upcoming battle is when they do engage, they will have overwhelming numbers of material advantage that will enable them to hammer their way through.
And what Alex and Monty don't do is pursue Rommel at this point.
No, not at all.
They're not interested. They're clear that that's not the point. That the damage they're able to inflict is best left as it is. And so they don't go after him, which obviously then results in a political crackle back in Westminster. Like, what, why aren't you going? Doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But Alex completely protects Monty of this. Monty knows none of this. As far as he's concerned, they're absolutely one, and he has to have time to training. He has to have a full moon, which rules out September because he needs time for training, which means it has to be in October. And the only time the full moon is going to be in the right place at the right time is on the 23rd of October, which is the 3rd week of October. So that is when he's going to launch. And Alexander goes, "I completely agree. I will smooth that with the Prime Minister." Churchill chucks his toys out the pram, but Alex holds firm, and he says, "Okay." And Churchill eventually concedes a point, and he says, "Okay, but when you launch the battle, I want you to signal to me in code, and I want you to say zip." So that's what he agrees to do. He says, "Absolutely, I'm very happy to do that." And so Monty then sends off all his guys in rotation for training, and he also pulls people out of the line in rotation and sends them off, but partly for training, but also just to go and do physical exercise, lots of PT, and lots of swimming by the coast. Get fit, eat well. If you can take 4 days leave, take your 4 days leave in Cairo now. Now's the time to go and do it. And train and train and train. But the people who are getting the most training is 10 Corps, the Corps de Chasse. And what they're training is to go through minefields in the middle of the night. So lots of tape is laid out. They attack in night. They have dummy mines. They have flares. And they go over and over and over again in convoys. And so it's not just a question of battling your way through minefields. It's also your march order. It's also about working out, we've worked out now that this causes lots of dust and we can't see anything. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we're going to get in more goggles. We're going to get in, you need more lights at this particular point, whatever it is. And they just train and train and train and get fit. And the whole of that part of the Western Desert, it just is transformed with vast supply dumps. And there's huge tented cities with miles upon miles of wires and pipelines and stashes of ammunition and rations and trucks beetling back and forth between the Canal Zone and Cairo and Alex and the front. And, you know, anyone who sees this just thinks, wow, we mean business. You know, this is doing it properly. For the first time, we're going to be ready for this.
You can argue, and John McManus would, that this is the Lend-Lease effect really coming into bloom, isn't it? Is that the British have decided to pause here and let Lend-Lease sort of
kick in,
float and float all boats, as it,
Yeah, well, we're going to talk to John obviously in the next episode.
Yes,
and we will be talking about the impact of the Americans in the summer of 1942 and the part they play in all these battles, which is not inconsiderable, it has to be said. Yeah. But yes, absolutely. You know, from the 300 Shermans through to lots of self-propelled guns to all sorts of stuff, and to the arrival of the 57 Fighter Group and the 98th Bomb Group as well, who were integrated into the Desert Air Force at this point. And
the plan is because this is interesting, isn't it? Because this is the first that there's not been an attack for a year, has there, by 8th Army?
Well, not since November.
Not since November, exactly. Is to take the initiative finally, but within the what you can achieve with 8th Army, what you can achieve with the training you've got, what you can achieve with the officers and kit you've got, and not try and do anything that's beyond its grasp to deliver a sure victory, but also actually to do for Rommel. And the way to do that is to bring massive force to bear. So what's to come is actually, I mean, what's interesting about Alamein is it demonstrates lots of things we keep coming back to again and again on this podcast. Is that they characterize this battle is that attacking is really difficult. That's the first principle in this modern combined arms mechanized warfare. Is attacking is really, really hard, which is why when, as we'll see, things don't necessarily pan out exactly as they're hoped for.
But I think before we get on to the final battle, which will be in the next episode, I think it's worth just looking at the Axis perspective.
Well, yes, where
they're
absolutely.
at in the last sort of 10 minutes or so.
Well, they're all over the place for a start, aren't they?
They are all over the place, but I think it's worth kind of just going into that a little bit, because it's not just a question of them running out of parts. There's kind of sort of more to it than that. And I think it's also worth just having another look at the Luftwaffe, because actually the numbers of Luftwaffe at the beginning of October 1942 are not inconsiderable. But Kesselring, who is above Rommel, who is the commander-in-chief of all German forces in the south, decides that the way to give Rommel the best chance is to allow shipping to have a free passage. And what's the best way to allow free passage? Is to attack Malta. So he transfers lots of Luftwaffe forces back to Sicily for what is going to be the last blitz of Malta.
Yeah.
And this is launched on, I think it's the 10th or 11th of October. And within 4 days, they've lost 82 planes.
Yes, it's a disaster.
And he keeps going right up to the eve of Alamein. And they lose 350, which on one level doesn't sound a lot by European standards, but by the standards of what's going on in the Mediterranean Air War, that is a big lot. And 9 ships and 41,409 tons are sunk. Axis convoys are sunk just in October alone.
But this is the perpetual German problem. Is you could argue those fighters would be better used over the desert, but then that leaves Malta unbothered. So the Germans are always robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Absolutely.
In everything they do, and the Luftwaffe in particular. Luftwaffe's like the one fire engine in an enormous city that's on fire, isn't it?
Yes.
From conflagration to conflagration.
And the interesting thing is, in terms of fighter planes, actually on the eve of Alamein, the Luftwaffe have got more in North Africa than the Desert Air Force.
Yeah.
In terms of fighters, I think they've got 595 and the DAF have got 510 or something like that. But actually, that's completely irrelevant because they don't have enough bombers because they use more fuel. Training of new pilots is suffering because of fuel. Ground crew has started to be stripped out for Luftwaffe Field Division, so they haven't got enough ground crew. So the knock-on effect in North Africa is that ground crews are, obviously struggling for lack of parts. They're also struggling for lack of numbers to do the job. It's just too much for too few. Air crews are struggling for lack of fuel. And because bombers are harder to maintain and use more fuel, they're reduced in numbers. So their effectiveness is not great. And of course, we haven't talked about it, but there's, all the raids by the SAS and the LRDG, Sidi Harnish on the 27th of July, where 31 planes are destroyed. That's the biggest, but there's others.
That's rubbing their noses in it.
It's rubbing their noses in it. And then there's another big blow, because the other way is that the British way is to not worry about individual scores and worry about what the mass is achieving. Whereas there is still this cult of the Experten within the Luftwaffe. And obviously one of the greatest aces of all, if not the greatest ace of all, is Hans-Joachim Musse, who's the star of Africa, who's this extraordinary character, kind of sort of very feminine looking, son of a general. His sister gets murdered in Germany. He's a total maverick. I mean, completely eccentric, absolutely bonkers. But completely brilliant at what he does. And on the 1st of September, during the Battle of Alamein, he shoots down 17 British aircraft in one day. They're all fighter planes. He's absolutely incredible. But it's absolutely clear that he is a totally busted flush, that he's suffering very, very badly from combat fatigue. And on the 26th of September, he's involved in this fight, this dogfight with this obviously very, very skilled Spitfire pilot. And they just fly round and round and round, and neither can get on the tail of the other. Eventually, they involved in this kind of sort of 300 feet off the deck, kind of, high-speed pass at each other. They both break in the opposite directions, and then, but he hits the Spitfire pilot, and he's just climbing out, and he sees the Spitfire start to burn, and then dives down on him and knocks him out. But when he then touches back down, as his engine cuts out, he falls asleep in the cockpit, and he has to be pulled out. He's covered in sweat. He's absolutely broken. And then a few days later, on the 30th of September, he's flying one of the new ME-109 Gs. One of the problems with the Gs is that they've got this, that they don't have ball bearings in, they don't have the right sort of thing. So the engine starts to overheat, and he catches fire, and he has to bail out. And as he bails out, he hits the stabilizer at the back, knocks himself unconscious, and plummets to the ground, and that's him done. And it's a massive blow to the morale of the Luftwaffe as a whole in North Africa, that they're gilded, the most brilliant of them all has finally succumbed, and it's kind of symbolic of the kind of mire in which they find themselves. And that's not good, because that means that they've got the RAF got that sort of massive material advantage for the battle to come, which is going to prove, frankly, decisive. And Rommel knows that he's in a terrible situation. And, it's interesting when you look at it. So do you know our old friend Hans von Luck? Do you remember him?
Well, yes. I mean, his account of all this is very. I've always taken with a bit of a pinch of salt. That he goes that because he goes all the way to see Hitler, doesn't he? And I knocked the dust out of my uniform and explained to the all that.
Well, he gets out to Mersa Matruh on about the 21st of September, and he's been called in by Rommel to take over the command of the reconnaissance battalion of 21st Panzer. And when he gets to Mersa Matruh, everyone's about to move. Rommel is about to go back to Germany and talk to Hitler. Galzer, his chief of staff, is about to go back too on leave. Also, the Nering is ill, so he's about to be replaced as the Africa commander.
Yeah,
and so it just looks like the whole command is just suddenly collapsing before him. And it's kind of interesting that same day that Rommel flies off to Germany, the 23rd of September, is the same day that the Joseph N. Teal Liberty ship is made, within 10 days.
Yeah, I mean, by this point, though, I mean it's in the official history of GCHQ. One of the points the author makes is he says it's interesting that the British go through this business of attacking when Rommel's away or when people are away.
Yes.
They've obviously they can't make him leave. But they've got an eye on when, obviously Monty needs his full moon and all that sort of stuff. But the fact that Rommel's not around when Battle of Alamein actually occurs is quite interesting. And they know he's not. They know he's not around because just as the equipment picture and the air superiority picture has flipped by this second half of 1942, so is the intelligence picture. And the British have sorted out their wireless traffic problem, and also stopped up fellas, and also, this is one of the sort of purple patches for Enigma, for Ultra rather, and so there is this very odd moment where the the seesaw of fate goes bonk like that.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
In the Allies' favour, and the Germans are high up on the seesaw, having previously tipped it their way, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And it's Rommel goes home. I mean, the problem
Rommel goes and sees Hitler.
The problem with von Luck's account, though, is that von Luck says, yes, of course, Rommel was depressed and everyone was fed up and tired. Maybe von Luck's writing for a post-war audience a little.
Yeah, but very possibly.
We just don't know. But things are, I mean, Rommel does know how bad things are and does know how sort of strung out he is. But that doesn't mean he says to Hitler, actually, you know what? We need to withdraw to Tobruk.
Well, he doesn't say that.
No, exactly. That's the point. He doesn't do any of that.
He doesn't say that. He goes up. He goes and sees Keitel, Jodl, and Hitler himself. He has a one-to-one audience, and he says, I've now got a battalion holding a mile of line. We're putting down lots of mines, but the problem is lots of people are getting sick because the rations aren't getting through, and so they're not getting enough food, and the food they're getting is not good enough quality. That needs to be sorted. We're being bombed and strafed all the time. It's very difficult to kind of hold this line. What we need is lots more supplies and quickly. Yeah. And, our Italian partners are completely useless. They're, at best used just about okay for defence, but certainly not for attack. They're completely rubbish. Which
isn't fair. That isn't a fair assessment, because some of the Italians are pretty handy, actually. And so
some of them are, yeah, and a lot of them are, So, and so that he's not helping himself there. I mean, there's no attempt to kind of, okay, well, let's try and train together. Let's try and kind of, what can we do together? How can we improve this situation? None of that.
But you know what? I mean, from your Sicily book, how all that table talk descends into. Well, and anyway, they've all got fat wives, and when the Germans talk about the Italians, even if he's that conversation will have descended into, well, they're all useless anyway. They all eat too much pasta. That's why we can't train with them. They're inferior. They're temperamental Latins and all that. That's the tenor of what's gone on. And I think what's interesting is Rommel, Hitler does a number on him and says, "Don't worry, I'll get you your Tiger tanks," and looks him in the eye and shakes him by the hand and fires him. Lights the pilot light inside Rommel and sends him on his way. And I think it's extraordinary because
Oh, so that's all right then.
Well, exactly. So that's all these are whenever you sort of when you weigh Rommel in the sort of in the scales of history, you've got to remember that he would do things like that. He'd go see Hitler. He'd be convinced by Hitler. He'd go back to the desert, and then whereas what he should be saying is, we need to shorten our lines. We need to create a situation where if the British want to come at us, they've got to do it at some distance, so we've got fair warning.
All that.
Because after Alamein, things are static, essentially. So it's not like you'd be retreating in the face of an advancing enemy, which is the thing you don't do, militarily, if you can possibly avoid it. It's very peculiar, and all it takes is the old Führertacht, the old tap on the elbow and the unwavering glare in the eye.
Blast of halitosis, and he's
exactly,
off.
And he goes, "Oh, okay, that sounds brilliant, my
All right, boss.
Okay, boss." And maybe
Hitler... You're sure about those tigers, are you?
Well, exactly. When's he made a field marshal?
After July. In July.
You see, so that's all part of it too. Hitler's very, very keen at promoting people and making them feel great about themselves, even when their situation. Well, often, especially when the situation is really, really, really tricky. And that's got to be all part of this. The Desert Fox is as vulnerable to the Führertacht as anybody else in the German establishment.
Absolutely. But the other thing that I think is brilliant about this, and just crazy about this particular trip that he does, is he also catches up with Goering and says that, the Luftwaffe aren't really putting their weight.
Oh, yeah.
And he says, and by the way, the British have now got Hurricanes armed with 40mm cannons, which are destroying Panzers. And Goering goes, "Quite impossible. Nothing but pilots' lies. All the Americans can make are razor blades and refrigerators."
Oh, God.
And that is contemporary. I mean, there's no question about that. That's not Hans von Luck writing his memoirs later.
That's just, for heaven's sake.
I know. I got it wrong. It's not Nering. It was von Mellenthin by this time. It's the commanding officer of the Africa Corps. He's off sick. Westphal, who is the chief operations officer to the Panzer Army, he's also off sick. So von Von Thoma is now the temporary commander of the Afrika Korps, and General Jörg Stummer is acting commander of the Panzer Army. I mean, what a mess.
So they're undergoing like an organisational sort of convulsion, if nothing else, aren't they?
Yeah.
Everyone's getting used to new people. You could argue it's a mirror of what 8th Army's going through, except only at the top, 8th Army. There's not this general comb through. And also the star guy has absented himself. I mean, the scene is set for a titanic struggle. That thing Goering says, I mean, it's funny, but it also just sort of illustrates the absolute bitter tragedy that is the Second World War. That Goering's assessment of what American industry could deliver to the war is so stupid, is so ill-judged.
Yeah.
And at the core of all the German decision-making is people that thick and ill-informed. They're the people causing this tragedy on the continent of Europe and all around the world. We laugh at it, but it's the diabolical heart of this whole thing. It's people living in a fantasy world.
Absolutely.
Spending lives on their fantasy, running into reality. And that you know, I know this is an extraordinary story, this whole thing, but at the core of it is that fantastical view of the world that the Nazi high command had, that's led everyone to the abyss, and is going to lead all these German soldiers and all these Italian soldiers and then all these Duke soldiers into the meat grinder that is the Second Battle of El Alamein.
And on that note,
we have to stop there for our next episode.
Finally, about to get to the Second Battle of Alamein.
I feel like Winston Churchill. We're finally I get my battle.
All right, well, see you next time.
Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Cheerio.